The minister's widow slept in the barn with her sons. A rancher built them a room. The first thing I noticed was the smoke. Not a cook fire. Too thin, too pale, and coming from the wrong direction, from Cutter's old place on the slope, which had been empty since Cutter's lung gave out in February. I'd ridden past it a dozen times since spring and never seen so much as a stirred curtain. But that morning, coming back from the creek with 2 fence posts balanced across my saddle, I saw that smoke threading up from the chimney, and I pulled Dobie to a stop and sat there looking at it. I don't know why I went up. Habit, maybe. The land has a way of making you its keeper whether you ask to be or not. I'd been on my section, going on 19 years, and the ridge and the hollow below Cutter's had always been part of what I looked at when I looked north. Something burning in it felt like my business. The gate was open and there were wheel ruts fresh in the mud from 2, maybe 3 days before. I rode in slow, let Dobie blow. A woman came out of the house before I reached the porch. She had a broom in her hand and she held it like she wasn't sure whether to sweep with it or swing it. 30, maybe 32. Dark hair pulled straight back, dress that had been good once and was now just clean. She looked at me the way people look at a thing that might bite. I told her my name, told her I ran the Carver section south of the ridge. She didn't move. I saw smoke, I said. Yes, she said. There is smoke, we have a fire. That was all she gave me. I sat there on Dobie feeling stupid. Then one of the boys appeared in the doorway, couldn't have been more than 7, and he stared at me with eyes too large for his face, and behind him was a smaller one, maybe 5, who pressed against his brother's back and peeked around. I asked if they'd spoken to Cutter's daughter about the property. She said they had, said they were paying rent. She said it like she was daring me to challenge it, her chin up, jaw set. I believed her. A woman who stands in a doorway with a broom and a look like that isn't lying about what she's owed. I tipped my hat and rode back. I heard about them in town a week later. The way you hear things at the feed store when 2 men are talking, and you're standing close enough to listen without meaning to. Reverend Hobart's widow. He'd served the church out at Millhaven for 11 years, then died of a fever in May, gone in 4 days. Nothing left behind but a house that belonged to the congregation, a small debt to the grain merchant, and 2 boys. The congregation had been kind. They are always kind at first, and then the kindness ran out the way it does when a dead man can't preach anymore and a widow can't fill the pews. She'd been offered 3 months in the manse and then gently shown toward the road. She had a cousin who'd written from somewhere near the Platte. She had a wagon, she had the boys, and she had, apparently, wound up at Cutter's Hollow instead. I thought about that on the ride home, thought about it more than I meant to. I'm not a man who thinks loudly. I work, I sleep, I rise before light and work again. The ranch had been my father's and his father's before that, and there was always something needing doing on it, fencing or calving or cutting hay or fighting the water when the creek ran wrong. There was no wife. There'd been a woman I wanted to marry once, a long time ago, and it hadn't come to what I hoped, and after that I'd made my peace with the particular quiet of a man who works alone. It's a different quiet than loneliness. I want to be clear about that. I'd built the quiet myself, plank by plank, and I didn't mind it. The ranch ran small 40 head, mostly Herefords, and a remuda of 8 horses I sold and traded depending on the year. My father had run more cattle, but I'd cut the herd back after he died because I couldn't manage a large operation alone, and I wasn't inclined to hire. I liked knowing every animal by sight. I liked the work being mine in the same way the land was mine, all of it familiar, all of it earned. That particular autumn I was putting up hay and closing the far fence, and doing the 100 small jobs that September demands, and mostly I didn't have time to think about anything but the work in front of me. But at night, sitting in the kitchen with my coffee and the lamp turned low, I thought about those 2 boys in the doorway. I thought about the September air, which was still mild now but wouldn't be in 6 weeks. And I thought about Cutter's place, which I'd been inside twice and knew the north wall sweated in cold weather, and the chimney drew mean when the wind came off the ridge, and there was a gap under the back door you could fit 3 fingers under. I told myself it wasn't my concern. I went back the next Thursday with a pound of lard, 2 cured hams, a sack of cornmeal, and a jar of apple butter I'd put up myself the fall before. She wouldn't take it. She stood at the door and looked at what I'd pulled from the saddlebag, and her face went the color of good brick, and she said, quiet but final, "We are not accepting charity, Mr. Carver." "It's not charity," I said. "I've got more than I can use before frost and it'll turn." That was a lie. She knew it was a lie. We looked at each other. The smaller boy had come around the side of the house and was standing in the dirt looking at the ham the way a child looks at something he very much wants, but has been taught not to ask for. His shoes were thin. The left one had a piece of cord where the buckle should have been. I said I could use some help with mending. I've got a pile of shirts and trousers been waiting on a needle for 2 years. That wasn't a lie. It was almost embarrassing how true it was. She looked at the ham. She looked at me. Then she looked at the boy in the dirt, and something moved across her face that she didn't let me see all of. "Bring the mending," she said. Her name was Clara Hobart. She told me on the 3rd visit when I came back with the mending, an actual pile of it, 2 flour sacks full, and she opened the door and looked at the sacks, and something at the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but close to one. The boys were Edmund and Will. Edmund was 7, serious, already trying to be the man of things in the way boys do when their father's gone and their mother's burden is visible. He had a quality of watchfulness about him, the kind that comes from being the eldest in a shrunken household, from learning to read a room before he entered it. Will was 5 and had no such weight on him yet. He was at that age where everything is interesting. The hammer I set down, the way Dobie tossed his head, the particular way a wood chip curls when you split a knot. He followed me around the property the second time I came and asked questions without stopping, one rolling into the next without waiting for the answer to the first. He reminded me of myself a little, which is not something I would have said out loud. The gap under the back door, I'd brought a strip of leather and fixed it the first Thursday, quiet, while Clara was inside with Edmund doing his letters. She noticed when she swept that evening. I found out later. She didn't say anything about it to me for 2 weeks, and when she did it was only, "The door lays much better now," said in a tone that meant something more than that but wasn't going to say so directly. I appreciated that. It matched how I operated. I kept coming. I found reasons. There was always a reason if you looked for one, a length of rope they could use, a tin of coal oil. The back step was rotting soft, and it took me one morning to replace it. Clara said nothing about the step either. She just began using it without the careful 2-step she'd been doing around the rotten board, and I filed that away as acceptance of the same kind. I'm a man who's good with his hands and bad with his mouth, and for once that balance served me. You can say a great deal with a replaced step that you'd bungle if you tried to say it out loud. There was a man in town, Fitch, ran the land office, who asked me one morning at the Mercantile whether I'd been helping the widow up at Cutter's place. He said it in the tone men use when they're not asking a question but making an opinion known to whoever will listen. I told him yes. He said something about propriety and how it looked, a single man visiting a young widow regular. He used the word charitable in a way that wasn't really about charity, and the word appearances twice, and he let a long pause fall in where I was supposed to feel some concern about what people were saying and perhaps adjust my behavior accordingly. I am not a man who shortens other men when they're talking. I waited until Fitch was done. Then I said, "She's got 2 boys, a bad chimney, and a gap under her back door. I'm a neighbor," and I picked up my order and left. He called something after me that I didn't fully catch and didn't turn to hear the rest of. There are opinions that don't deserve to be heard to their conclusion. I thought about Fitch on the ride home. I thought about the particular kind of man who looks at a widow with 2 children sleeping cold in a leaking house and sees something to speculate about rather than something to fix. I don't understand that kind of thinking, and I never have. My father would have said that a man who walks past a neighbor's need and gossips about whoever's filling it isn't worth much as a man, and my father was right about most things. Some men confuse providing for someone with making a claim on them. That's a particular kind of small thinking, and I've always had contempt for it. You help because help is needed and because you're capable of giving it. That's the whole of it. If people wanted to talk about what I was doing up at Cutter's Hollow every Thursday, they were welcome to talk. The step was replaced, the door laid flat, the woodpile was growing. Talk doesn't change any of that, and it doesn't keep 2 boys warm in November. October came. The ridge started turning gold and the mornings had teeth in them, and one evening I rode up and found Clara outside with a coat that wasn't enough coat, stacking the last of what she'd split for the winter woodpile. She split it herself. I stood there looking at the pile, which was a third of what they'd need. I did not say, "That's not enough." I said, "I've got a cord and a half cut and no room left in my shed." She stopped. She had the axe in her hand. She looked at the wood, then at me. "How much room do you have?" she said. "Not enough for what I cut," I said. She knew I was lying again, but she let me lie. She nodded once short and went inside, and I spent 2 days bringing wood up from my own pile in the wagon, and she never mentioned it and neither did I. She did, however, send Edmund down the following week with a cloth-wrapped package that turned out to be a pie, dried apple, with good pastry, and a note in her even handwriting that said only, "For your kindness this autumn." I ate it over 2 days, and the pastry was better than anything I'd eaten since my mother died. I kept that to myself. The cold came in the second week of November, and it came hard. Dropped 30 degrees in an afternoon, and by the following morning there was ice at the creek, and the sky was that pressed white that means snow inside a day. I was out mending the near fence when the weather turned, and I pushed through it and got my animals in and built the fire up and sat in my kitchen eating cold biscuit and listening to the wind off the ridge. I thought about the north wall at Cutter's place. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, before it was light, I harnessed the team and put 2 quilts and a cast iron pot in the wagon bed and drove up the ridge road in the dark. The cold was significant. A man my age, I was 44 that year, feels cold differently than he did at 30. It gets into the joints and sits there. The team wanted to slow on the grade, and I kept them moving with my voice more than the lines, because my hands were too stiff to feel the reins properly. By the time I came up the last rise to Cutter's, my breath was going out of me in rags. The lamp was lit in the house. I could see it through the window, orange and small, the particular thin light of an oil lamp when the wick is turned too low, which told me they were rationing. I pulled the team up and got down and knocked. Edmund opened the door. He was dressed, which told me something, and behind him Will was on the cot closest to the fireplace with both quilts from the bed piled on top of him. Clara was crouched in front of the hearth feeding the fire with careful, deliberate pieces, the way you feed a fire when you are worried about your wood supply. She turned when I came in. The north wall had ice on the inside. I could see it from where I stood. A thin rime along the bottom log, and the gap at the window stuffed with what looked like one of Edmund's shirts, and the floor cold enough that I felt it through my boots within a few steps. Will's face was pale above the quilts. He looked at me with those large, serious eyes that children get when they don't feel well and are trying not to say so. "There's a room in my house," I said. She stood up from the fire. Her face was tired in the lamplight, the kind of tired that isn't from one bad night but from a long accumulation of bad nights she hadn't let herself complain about. Her hair was loose, which I hadn't seen before. It fell to her shoulders and she pushed it back with one hand and looked at me. "Mr. Carver." "2 rooms off the back," I said. I added them on when I thought I'd have a family. They've been empty 8 years. There's a stove in the near one. It heats the other one too through the wall." She looked at me for a long time. She wasn't a woman who made decisions quickly, and I respected that about her, even standing there in the cold of that leaking room with ice on the wall behind her. "We are not," she said slowly, "going to be a burden to you." "You won't be," I said. "I've been feeding 3 people from my smokehouse for 2 months, and the only burden that's put on me is I'm running low on excuses to come up here." I hadn't meant to say that much. The cold must have loosened something in me. She looked at me. Then she looked at Edmund, who was standing very still with his serious face on, and at Will, who had emerged partway from his quilts and was watching us both with those large eyes. "For the winter," she said. "For whatever you need," I said. She looked at me a moment longer, weighing it the way she weighed everything. Then she turned to Edmund and said, "Start packing your things," and that was the whole of the decision. She cooked. I hadn't had a hot breakfast in 9 years, maybe 10, since before my father died and I'd been running the place alone. The first morning she was in my kitchen she made eggs and fried salt pork and cornbread, and a pot of coffee that was actually coffee, not the scorched gruel I'd been making myself. And I sat down at my own table and ate, and it was like something I'd forgotten my body knew how to want. Will sat across from me and watched me eat with intense interest, the way small boys regard a large man eating, as though the scale of it is fascinating. He had a piece of cornbread in each hand and was alternating between them. Edmund sat beside his mother and ate with his serious attention, the way he did everything. She ran the house the way she did everything, quietly, efficiently, without asking for instruction or permission. She found where things were kept and she kept them better. She moved through my kitchen like she'd always known it, reorganizing nothing in the first week, just observing, and then in the second week making 3 small changes that were all improvements, and I noticed all 3 and said nothing. A woman who moves through a space that way is someone who respects the space. She didn't make my house hers. She made it function better, which is a different thing. She mended the shirts, the ones she hadn't already mended, working by lamplight in the evenings after the boys were in bed. She had a small sewing basket that she must have guarded carefully through everything, because it was well kept and organized in a way that suggested it had always been well kept, a point of order in whatever disorder surrounded it. I watched her work sometimes when she didn't know I was watching, her needle going in and out, quick and clean, her lips moving slightly sometimes the way people's lips move when they're thinking and don't realize it. Edmund helped with the small chores, feeding the chickens, carrying wood, things he could manage. He was earnest about it in that way of a boy trying to be worthy of something. I showed him how to check the water trough for ice in the morning, how to feel a hoof for heat, how to tell when a post was seated right by the sound of the mallet. He listened very carefully. He didn't say much, which I understood. There are people who learn by watching and doing, and whose silence while they do it isn't absence but attention. He was that kind. Will helped too, in the way a 5-year-old helps, which is to say he stood very close and commented on everything, and occasionally handed you the wrong tool with great confidence. One afternoon he handed me a chisel when I needed a hammer and told me with great authority that this was the one, as though the chisel and I were unfamiliar with each other. I thanked him and used the hammer. He didn't seem to notice. The third day, he put his hand in mine when we were walking back from the barn, just closed his small fingers around 2 of mine and walked that way, not saying anything. Just walking. The cold air in front of us and the barn behind us and the light already going low at 4 in the afternoon the way it does in November. And Will's small hand in mine, loose and trusting, like he'd been doing it his whole life. I didn't say anything, I just walked. I thought about building the room in late November. Thought about it the way I think about a fence line that needs re-driving, not all at once but slowly, from the outside in, working out the practical questions before you commit the labor. The west side of the house had a lean-to I'd never fully enclosed. I'd framed it 8 years back with the idea of adding a proper room, a bedroom, a place for children that I'd stopped expecting. The frame was still there, dry, not rotten, solid Douglas fir that my father had milled himself. All it needed was walls, a floor, a window, and a roof close. The materials were mostly on hand or available from town. The labor was mine. I went out there on a Sunday afternoon in late November when the weather had lifted a little and walked the framing and thought about it. 14 by 12 was what the frame allowed. That was enough. More than enough for what she had. She was sleeping in the back bedroom I'd given over to her and the boys, all 3 of them, and I could hear through the wall sometimes in the mornings. The boys arguing over something, or Will's laughter, or Clara's voice, low, settling whatever needed settling. I slept in the front room like I always had. My house was arranged in the way of a house, holding more than it was built for, which was a fine arrangement but not a permanent one. She needed her own room, a place with a latch on the inside that was hers. That was the whole thought. I didn't dress it up. I went out there with a lantern that Sunday afternoon and stood in the framing and measured with my eye and thought about the window, south-facing, for light. A good stove, pine floor from boards I'd been seasoning in the barn since spring, lime plaster inside. I started on the 1st of December. I didn't tell her what I was doing, I just started. She could see I was working on the linta from the kitchen window, and one afternoon she came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood in the cold and looked at what I'd done the east wall up, the studs plumb, the first course of siding on. "What is this?" she said. "A room," I said. "For whom?" I wrapped both hands around the cup. It was very cold still, mid-afternoon, and the coffee was good, better than I could make it. "You'll know more what you need than I do," I said. "A bed, a trunk, a place of your own. You tell me where you want the window." She was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the gap in the framing and she pulled her coat tighter. She looked at the east wall, the studs, the new siding. She looked at the space of it, the 14 by 12, the way a person looks at a thing and begins to understand what it is. "On the south side," she said, "for the light." "South side," I said, "all right." She handed me back the empty cup and went back inside. I drank the rest of my coffee and went back to work. A man working hard in winter cold doesn't think about much. That's one thing I've always liked about physical work. It fills the mind the same way it fills the hours, evenly, without room left over for the things that go in circles in your head when you're still. I framed the south wall. I cut the window opening. I hung the window I'd ordered from the mercantile the week before, good glass, double-sashed so it would hold against the weather. I cut flooring from the seasoned boards, tongue and groove, and laid it tight and planed the joints flat. I chinked the gaps and plastered the inside walls with lime I bought in town, 2 trips, the second trip in snow that came to the horses' hocks. I put a small iron stove in the corner and ran the flue up through the roof, doubling the flashing against ice. I built a shelf along the east wall from post oak, 8 inches wide, long enough to hold whatever she had to put on it. I built a bed frame from the same oak, mortised and pegged, no nails in the joints. It would outlast me. Edmund helped when he wasn't at his lessons. He was a steady worker. He handed me things without being asked once he understood what I was doing, which took about 20 minutes on the first morning, and then he had the whole logic of it. He didn't talk much while I worked, which was the right instinct. One afternoon he was holding a board while I drove nails and he said, without looking up, "My father could build things too." "Is that so?" I said. "He built the chicken coop at Millhaven," Edmund said. "Mama said it was crooked but it held." I drove another nail. "A crooked coop that holds is better than a straight one that falls," I said. Edmund thought about that. He was the kind of boy who thought about things rather than deflected them. "Yes," he said finally, "I think that's right." He didn't say anything else about his father after that. I didn't push it. There are things a boy carries that he's not ready to set down, and you don't take them from him. You just work beside him and let him know the work is solid and he is not doing it alone. That's what a man does with a boy when a boy needs it. You show him what doing a thing right looks like, and you let him be part of the doing, and you don't make a speech about any of it. Will came out too, when it wasn't too cold, and mostly he occupied himself picking up shavings and sawdust, and examining each one closely before putting it in the scrap pile. Once he brought me a particular wood shaving that had curled into a perfect spiral, and presented it to me with the gravity of a formal gift. I put it in my shirt pocket, and he watched it go in with great satisfaction. I finished the room on the 23rd of December. It wasn't much, by the measure of things I'd built. 14 by 12, a good pine floor, the south window with the afternoon light coming in low the way she'd wanted, the stove in the corner blacked and leveled, the shelf along the east wall for her things, the post oak bed frame with a new tick I'd filled myself with clean straw and covered with one of the good quilts I'd had folded in the chest at the foot of my bed since my mother made it. I hung the door, planed it so it fit right, not swollen in the jamb the way a poor hung door goes in winter. The hinges were brass. I'd ordered them special. I'd painted the trim white. I'm not sure why. I had the paint and it seemed right. I put a latch on the inside of the door. Her room, her latch. That morning I told the boys to stay in the kitchen and I led Clara through the back hall to the new door. She hadn't been back this way in the weeks I'd been building. She respected the work the same way I'd respected hers in the kitchen, as something that belonged to whoever was doing it. She'd asked me only once in the second week whether she could bring me something while I was working, and I'd said coffee if she had it, and she had. Otherwise she'd let me be. I appreciated that more than I had words for. I opened the door and stood back. She walked in. She stood in the middle of the room and turned around once, slowly, taking in the floor and the walls and the window and the shelf. The afternoon light was in through the south window just the way she described wanting it, coming in low and gold across the pine floor. The stove was cold, but the room held warmth from the house through the shared wall. It smelled of new wood and lime, and the particular dry smell of a well-built space, clean and tight. She went to the shelf on the east wall and put her hand flat on it, the way you do when you're testing that a thing is real. I stayed in the doorway. She didn't cry. I wouldn't have expected her to. She was not a woman who cried in front of people, and I thought probably not behind them either, not often. Grief and hardship had done something to her that was the opposite of brittleness. They had made her dense, solid, capable of absorbing impact without cracking. But she kept her hand on the shelf for a while, and when she turned around there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, exactly. Gratitude is a smaller thing, something you feel towards someone who has done you a courtesy. This was something older and quieter than that. She walked to where I was standing in the doorway. She stopped in front of me, close enough that I was very aware of the particular way she smelled. Wood smoke and something clean, soap or maybe just cold air on her skin. And she put her hand flat on my chest, over the coat, over the flannel beneath it, just her palm there, and she looked up at me. "Thank you, Jonas," she said. First time she'd used my given name. I put my hand over hers. That was all I did. My hand on my chest, both of us standing in the doorway of the room I'd built her in the cold tail end of December. The low light coming through the south window the way she'd asked for, and I could hear Will laughing at something in the kitchen, some distant, unrelated happiness that had nothing to do with us and was a good sound anyway. "It's your home," I said, "for as long as you need it." She didn't move her hand. I didn't move mine. We stood there together in the doorway of the room. "I think," she said very quietly, "that we may need it for a long time." Christmas morning, the boys found 2 things each at the foot of their cots. I'd carved them in the barn at night over 3 weeks, a horse for Will and a hawk for Edmund, working by lantern when the cold was bad and the work was done, and there was nothing else to do with my hands. The horse had taken me the longest because I'd never been much for carving animals and had to figure it out on the first attempt and throw it and start again. The second one was better. I filed and rubbed it smooth, and it looked like a horse ought to look. I found a length of good cord and a pocket knife at the mercantile for Edmund. Will held the horse up at arm's length the moment he found it, his face open and pure with the particular wonder of a child who has received something that matches exactly what he wanted without having known he wanted it. He made the horse gallop across the window sill and then across his brother's shoulder. Edmund submitted to this with the patience of a much older brother and then looked at the knife for a long moment, turning it in his hands and then at me, and then he closed his hand around it slowly, private and formal, the way a man accepts a gift of consequence, and nodded once. That nod was enough. That was more than enough. Clara made a goose. I didn't know where she'd found a goose. I didn't ask. We ate at my table, the four of us, which was more people at that table than there'd been in 9 years, maybe longer. The goose was very good, better than it had any right to be given the limited spicing she'd had to work with. Will talked through most of the meal about the horse and the attributes he had ascribed to it, which were extensive and involved several names before he settled on one, which was General, which he said with the full weight of a word that means something important. Edmund listened to him with that tolerant attention of a brother who has heard many things and learned which ones to let pass. Clara watched them both with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hand, and a quiet look on her face like someone counting what they have instead of what they don't. When she caught me watching her, she didn't look away. After supper, Will fell asleep on the floor by the fire with his carved horse in his hand, General, fallen on his side in the firelight. I picked Will up and carried him to his cot without waking him, and he was very heavy for a 5-year-old, or maybe I was just noting it for the first time, the particular solid weight of a sleeping child, and I laid him down and pulled the blanket up. Edmund sat up for another hour at the table doing something in a small book, drawings, I realized, looking over his shoulder when I passed. He was drawing the ranch, the barn, the corral, Dobie at the fence. He'd gotten the roofline of the barn exactly right. He'd drawn the ridge behind it and the winter sky, and in the corner of the page, very small, the house. He was looking at it when I looked, adding a line to the roof, and then he added a small line of smoke from the chimney, and that was it. I went to bed. In the night I heard Clara's door, the new door, on its new brass hinges open, and then her steps in the hall, and then the quiet sound of her in the kitchen, banking the fire for the night. She was always last to bed. She moved through the house so quietly that sometimes I was aware of her only by the small sound she made, the particular creak of the third floorboard in the hall, the soft close of a cupboard, the scrape of the iron lid on the stove. The sounds of a house being tended by someone who cared about it. Then her door again, the new latch turning. I lay on my back in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around me in the cold, the way a house does at night, the wood finding its own level. And I thought that it didn't feel like my house anymore, or rather that it felt like my house in a way it never had, the way a thing feels inhabited, claimed, alive in the particular way of a place that holds more than one life. I had built something, not just the room. January and February were hard. They always are on the high ground, and we got through them. The boys helped with the animals, and Clara kept the house, and I kept the land. And the days had a shape to them that I hadn't had before, a shape that came from more than one person's needs and movements. I rose first and built the fire, and Clara came in 20 minutes later and made breakfast, and the boys came in after that, Edmund first and then Will loudly, and we ate, and then the day divided by what it required. There was a blizzard the third week of January that kept us in the house for 4 days. 4 days is a long time to be inside with 2 boys, and a woman you're not yet sure what to say to. But Clara managed the boys the way she managed everything, without drama, without the kind of tightening that comes when adults are stranded together and begin to chafe. She invented occupations for them. She taught Edmund a card game he was soon beating her at, which pleased him enormously. She told Will stories in the afternoon that she made up as she went, elaborate stories involving animals that talked and had occupations, and Will would sit with his knees pulled to his chest, and his whole face alive to whatever was coming next. On the second night of the blizzard, after the boys were asleep, she and I sat by the fire and she read aloud from her book of verse. She didn't ask if I wanted to hear it. She just opened it and began to read, and I listened, and the wind was doing what it did outside, and the fire was warm, and it was not a thing I would have anticipated wanting and turned out to be a thing I very much did. She read well. She read the way her husband must have read, not performing but meaning it, putting her voice behind the words like she understood what they were for. On the fourth night she closed the book and we sat quiet for a while, listening to the storm ease off, and she said, "Henry, my husband, he used to say that a hard winter was God's way of making a man appreciate his roof." I thought about that. He was right, I said. He was right about a great many things, she said. He was occasionally impractical about the smaller ones. "The crooked chicken coop," I said. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh fully, not just the small sound at the corner of her mouth but an actual laugh, and it changed her face in a way I was not prepared for. "Among others," she said. The fire settled. The wind outside had dropped to almost nothing. She looked at her hands folded in her lap and then she said, quiet, not looking at me, "Edmund is getting stronger, since we came here. He was very quiet after Henry died, too quiet, the kind of quiet that worried me, but he's less like that now." I didn't say anything. "Will too," she said. "He's always been Will, but Edmund," she paused. "He's becoming a boy again instead of a small old man. I think it's this place, the work you've given him." I looked at the fire. "He's a good worker," I said. "He is," she said. "He's also getting to be a boy around someone who treats him like one." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, and after a while she picked up her book again, and we sat there in the quiet of the settled storm until the fire burned low and she went to her room. In February, Edmund turned 8. Clara made him a cake, which was a thing requiring effort we didn't waste on ordinary days. Dried apple with a good sugar glaze she'd been saving the sugar for, and Will ate 2 pieces and then fell into the particular frenzy that sugar produces in small boys and ran around the kitchen until he fell over laughing. Edmund sat at the table with his cake and his serious face, and then slowly, the way a reserved person lets himself have something, he smiled. It was a good smile. He had his mother's mouth. I gave him his first proper lesson on a horse that week, the weather having broken enough for it. I took him out on my old bay, Mercy, who had patience enough for 10 children, and walked him through the corral for an hour, his back straight, his hands where I put them. He fell twice and got up twice and got back on. The second fall was harder. Mercy had shied at a crow, and he sat in the snow for a moment and looked at his hands, and then he got up. I told him after that lesson that he'd done well. He said, "I fell." "Yes," I said, "and got back on. That's the whole lesson." He thought about that in the way he thought about things. Then he said, "Jonah's," and stopped. "Go on," I said. "Are we going to stay here?" he said. "After winter." I looked at him, this boy with his mother's mouth and his father's name, and the eyes of someone who'd learned that the world was not reliably kind, and was deciding what to make of it anyway. "What does your mother say?" I said. "She says that's for you and her to decide," he said. "She says it's not for me to ask." "Then she's right," I said, "but I'll tell you what I think. I think this ranch works better with 2 sets of hands than 1, and I think you're becoming one of those hands, and I think your mother knows what she needs." He was quiet for a long time. The bay moved under him, patient. "All right," he said, like something had been settled in his head that he hadn't known needed settling. Then he asked me to show him how to make her move forward from a leg cue, and I showed him, and that was the end of it. We rode together most mornings after that when the weather permitted. I taught him the cues one at a time, not rushing them, and he was a natural in the way some people are not natural in that it came without effort, but natural in that when he got it right, you could see his whole body understand it at once, the horse and the boy settling into the same thought. Clara would sometimes watch from the back step with her coffee, not saying anything, just watching. One morning she was there when he took Mercy through a trot for the first time without falling off, and he pulled up at the end of the corral and turned the bay and looked at his mother, and she raised her cup slightly, just a small thing, and he sat up straight on that horse like he was 10 feet tall. I pretended to be checking the fence latch. Some moments don't need a witness. By the end of February, I was teaching him to read a cow and how to move her without spooking, and he was beginning to understand why you approach from one angle and not another, why you let the animal make the decision you've already arranged for her to make. He asked good questions. He asked the kind of questions that mean a person is already thinking past where they are, already looking at the next problem before the current one is fully solved. His father's son, maybe, or just himself, which was enough. March came in cold and went out warm, and in between there were 2 weeks of mud that made the lower pasture nearly impassable, and kept me close to the house doing the work that waits all winter: harness to mend, tools to sharpen, the east fence where the elk had pushed through in January. Good indoor work, close work, and Clara moved around me in the kitchen the way she always did, easy and quiet. And sometimes she stood at the table across from where I sat working and we talked, the real kind of talking, not weather or logistics, but the kind where you say something and the other person hears what you meant and not just what you said. She told me about Millhaven, about 11 years of the minister's wife, the particular work of it, the visiting and the listening and the managing of every grief and dispute that the congregation couldn't manage itself. She said Henry had been good at the preaching, but she had been the one who sat with people in the hard hours, and she didn't say it bitterly, only factually, the way a person accounts for what they actually did rather than what the title suggested. She had loved him, and she had been faithful to him, and she had done the work that needed doing alongside his work, and then he was gone, and the work had evaporated because the work was his. And she'd had to find out what was left when everything that had been framed around him was removed. I said I thought that was a hard thing to find out. She said, yes, but you find out. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. You find out what you actually are, not what you were in relation to someone else. I thought about what I actually was. A man who built things. A man who kept a piece of land going year after year because it was his, and because the doing of it satisfied something in him that he didn't need to name. A man who had ridden up a ridge road one September morning because the smoke was in the wrong place and had not stopped going back since. What did you find? I said. She looked at me. That I am more capable than I knew, she said, and lonelier than I could afford to admit. A pause. Until recently. I looked at the harness in my hands. The buckle I'd been working was fixed, but I kept my hands on it. Yes, I said, same. We didn't say anything else about it that day. We didn't need to. Spring came the way it always does up here. Not all at once, but in parcels. A warm day, then too cold, then something that smells like mud and distance, then a week of hard rain, and then one morning you walk out and the grass is showing and the whole valley is a color that doesn't have a name, and you stand there like you've never seen it before, even though you've seen it 20 times. I was standing at the corral fence on a morning like that in late March, watching the light come down the slope, and the horses move in the far pasture, Dobie among them with his gray head up, just standing in the new grass and breathing in the particular way of a horse that has survived a winter and knows it. Clara came out with coffee. She handed me mine and stood beside me close, and we looked at the valley, the same view I'd looked at since I was a boy, my father's view before me. It's beautiful, she said. Yes, I said, it is. She put her arm through mine, just set her hand in the crook of my elbow, easy and unannounced, like it was a thing she'd been doing for years. I felt her shoulder against my arm and the warmth of her through the coat. The coffee was warm in my hands. Dobie moved along the far fence, pulling at the first green. The boys were still inside, asleep still at this hour, and the valley was turning from purple to gold as the sun came up over the ridge. I thought about what she'd said in December, in the doorway of the room I'd built her. I think we may need it for a long time. I thought she'd meant the room, or the house, maybe she had. I thought maybe she'd meant something else entirely, and that she had known what she meant when she said it, and that she had said it anyway, which was its own kind of declaration from a woman who was not careless with words. I thought about that first morning, the smoke from Cutter's Hollow, the woman with the broom in her hand and her chin up and her two boys in the doorway. I thought about the gap under the back door and the rotting step and the cord and a half of wood I didn't have room for. I thought about how a man who is good with his hands and not so good with his mouth can say what needs saying by doing what needs doing, and how that had always seemed to me a reasonable way to live, not because it was all I had, but because, when it's all you have, you learn to make it mean something. I had built something over this winter. I had built a room, yes, 14 by 12, post oak floor, south window, good brass latch on the inside. But I had also built towards something I hadn't known I was still capable of wanting. I was 44 years old and had made my peace with a certain kind of life, and then the smoke from Cutter's Hollow had come up through the September air, and I had ridden up the ridge road without knowing why. And now I was standing at my corral fence in the first light of spring with a good woman's arm through mine, and the valley was doing what it did every year, and it had never looked quite like this before. I put my hand over hers where it rested in the crook of my arm, my rough hand over her cold, small one, and she leaned into me just a little, and we stood there not talking. Will's voice came from inside the house, loud and immediate, the way 5-year-old voices are, asking Edmund something with great urgency. Edmund's answer came back lower, tolerant, the voice of a boy becoming something steadier. Clara laughed low under her breath. I held my coffee in her hand and watched the light move down the valley in that way it does in spring, not in a rush, patient, the way good things move, the way they always moved when they were going to last. The horses were moving in the far pasture. Dobie had his head up, looking south, the way a horse looks when something is coming that it trusts. The grass was showing green along the creek. The sky was that particular clear blue that only happens in the first weeks of it, before the heat comes and changes everything. I was a man who had worked this land for 19 years, and intended to work it for as many more as I had. I was a man who built things to last. I was a man who was not easy to know and not easy to move, and who had been moved, and was standing in the proof of it with his coffee going cold in his hands and not caring at all. I thought about Fitch at the land office with his opinions about appearances. I thought about the empty room I'd framed 8 years back and left framed, the way you leave something unfinished when the reason for finishing it goes away. I thought about the particular quiet I'd built myself, plank by plank, the one I'd said was different from loneliness. I still think that was true. But standing there with Clara's arm in mine and the valley going gold in front of me, I also thought that the quiet had been a good second choice, and that this was the first choice, and that sometimes a man gets to the first choice later than he'd have liked and has to decide whether that matters. It didn't matter. That was the answer I came to standing there. The ridge was the same ridge. The fence line was the same fence line. The land asked the same things it always asked, and I was capable of the same answers. But the space inside all of it was different now. It had people in it. It had her arm in mine, and the sound of 2 boys starting their morning behind that window, and the particular way she leaned into me, quiet and certain, like a woman who has found her footing and intends to keep it. She was still there, her arm in mine, her shoulder against me, her breath going out visible in the cold morning air and then gone. The boys would be up soon. There was work. There was always work. But for another minute, I just stood there and held what I had and looked at the valley and let it be enough, which it was, which it was exactly.